The Iowa Utilities Board is back in session. For the information of those in the audience, this is SPU 2018-0007. The time is approximately 8:35 a.m. For the information of everyone that is viewing, it is our intent to call up the first witness, which will be Mr. Reed. Upon completion of Mr. Reed and after consultation with the attorneys, it is our intent to go into closed session for Mr. Reed and Mr. Bauer. Is there any objection to that?
No objection.
No objection.
Mr. Marcus, do you have any objection to us going into closed session following Mr. Reed?
No, that's fine.
For both Reed and Bauer.
Okay.
IPL, you may call your first witness.
IPL calls Mark Reed.
Good, thanks.
I turned it on.
Mr. Reed? Please raise your right arm. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is true and accurate?
I do.
You may be seated. You may proceed.
Is this on? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Please state your name and spell your last name.
My name is Mark Reed. My last name is spelled R-E-E-D.
And Mr. Reed, did you have cause to file on this docket both direct and rebuttal testimony?
I did.
And if asked the same questions that you gave in written form, would you give the same answers today?
I would.
Your Honor, I do have an offer of proof for a document I would like to enter. It's been marked as Exhibit 216, and I'll hand it out with the court's permission. Counsel already has these documents. And the witness will need one as well.
So all of the parties have a copy of that, or?
Yes.
All right.
Mr. Reed, you have before you what's been marked as IPL Exhibit 216. Do you recognize this document?
I do.
And what is it?
It is a test report for FCC Part 15, Subpart B testing for our electric meter. What it is, its purpose is for any digital device released into the market, you have to test that a digital device does not emit energy in bands that they don't want you to emit energy, unintended radiation. They also require testing for conducted radiation on power lines that you're connected to.
And when was this document created based upon the date in the front?
August 17th, 2015.
And why was it created?
Any device that needs to be sold in the marketplace needs to have this testing done to show that it won't affect any electronic device needs this.
And this is a complete and accurate copy of the testing results?
It appears to be, yes.
Your Honor, I would move its admittance. Mr. Reed testified that the devices that are being used by IPL and provided by Census meet all FCC requirements. This specifically refers to FCC Part 15 itself, which is referenced in documents entered by Ms. Matara at Matara Rebuttal Exhibit C, which is a confidential part of the testimony. I mention that to say that this is an issue in this case. Most specifically, the board has allowed the interveners to put in another round of testimony, specifically that of Mr. Bathgate. And Mr. Bathgate has testified that the census meters radiate at something approximating 1,000 times the FCC limit. This document, which is required by the FCC, shows that in that specific area, which has been alleged as dirty energy by the interveners, they're in compliance.
Are there any objections? Hold on, Mr. Schuling. Mr.
No
Cook?
objection from OCA.
Mr. Marcus?
Yeah, I don't object to the admission of the document, but I object to the testimony about what it shows. Mr. Reed can testify about that if he's capable, but I would like to strike Mr. Callisto's statements about the document showing compliance.
So, Mr. Marcus, this is a great opportunity for me to make this statement. I agree that the attorneys should not be testifying. They have witnesses that they have presented, and if you want the witness to present that information, then you need to ask the witness the questions to obtain the information you wish to have in the transcript. For that information that has come before, and for Mr. Callisto's current testimony that he just gave, we will admit it based upon the fact that we believe the board has the ability to determine whether or not that testimony was provided by a witness or not.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Turner?
I would just add all of the same points with regard to the characterization of Mr. Beth's testimony, which you've answered here as well.
Thank you. Do you have anything in addition?
No, and I agree with that.
All right. Mr. Callisto, you may proceed.
Thank you. So the document is submitted?
Yes, I apologize. The IPL Exhibit 216 is admitted, and the comments of the parties are noted.
Thank you, Your Honor. The witness is available for cross-examination.
Mr. Schuling?
OCA has no questions for Mr. Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Mr. Marcus?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Reed.
Morning.
Census has sold smart meters to IPL for deployment in Iowa, correct?
Yes.
And does Census also provide a good part of the infrastructure, the towers, for example, and relay
We don't
stations?
build the towers, but we supply the base station unit that goes at the base of the tower, yes.
Okay, so some of the hardware, what other hardware do you supply?
Some hardware for locally communicating to the meters, but generally, the vast majority is the base station and the meter itself.
Okay. And is there software that you're also providing?
There is software all through the system. There's software we call it firmware in the meters. There's firmware in the base stations. And then the base stations communicate to a head-end that we call a regional network interface, and there's software there.
Okay. And are there several regional interfaces, the head ends?
No, there's typically one per
One.
customer.
One, and a customer means IPL? in this
Yes.
case. Okay. Can you say, I don't know if this treads on, I don't think it could be confidential, approximately how much of the total purchase price for the package you've been paid so far in terms of a percentage?
I'm sorry, I'm an engineer. I don't
Okay.
have the sales data
Okay.
or marketing data.
Okay.
Mr. Marcus?
Yes.
I'm wondering if it would be assistive if you moved the mic to the edge of the table.
This way?
We'll
Or no,
just
this-
further towards you,
Okay, sure.
and then you can move it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Would you go to page 3 of your direct testimony, line 21?
Okay?
Could you read the first sentence there, beginning because?
Because of the long range of the system, messages are transmitted directly from the meter endpoints to the base station towers with no intermediate hops.
That's not completely accurate, though, isn't that correct?
The system as designed is designed exactly the way it says in the testimony.
Okay,
As a fallback we have the ability to go to an adjacent meter and repeat the data.
That's the buddy system.
That is the buddy system, that's right.
So, but this sentence doesn't say that that's sort of a backstop, and that's also part of the program. It just says because of the long range, messages are transmitted directly from the meter endpoints to the base station with no intermediate hops. Correct?
That's what it says.
Okay.
In many installations, there are many that we have, modern installations that have 0 buddies in the entire network.
I'm not sure what that means. I'm talking about Iowa. We understand you have a buddy system. Were you talking about other states, other systems?
Well, I hope that Iowa will eventually be one of those as well. When we initially install the system, we want to hear from all the meters while we're tuning the system. So it would be our goal to have 0 buddies in Iowa as well, although we may have some right now.
Yeah, I'm not sure then that I understood the last remark. Are you saying that during this initial phase, you're trying to get the buddy system going, to have the meters talk?
We're trying to get data from every meter,
Okay.
which will include using the buddy system only if needed.
Well, do you determine in advance that you're going to use the buddy system, or does it just happen because of impediments in the way?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
I thought you were proposing that there was a situation now at the outset where you're trying to actually get the buddy system involved to see how it's working?
Try not to get it involved.
Okay. So that's even now?
It's a fallback, not a first-line use.
Okay. And the next sentence, beginning on line 23, is this makes FlexNet a point-to-point direct endpoint to the tower system. But that's, except for the buddy system, is that correct? That would be.
That's correct.
Okay.
It's the only system on the market that operates in that manner.
Would you go to page 4, line 10? And there, you're asked at what power do the census meters using FlexNet transmit? You see, and the answer is the effective radiated power, ERP, of the metering endpoints is typically 1.25 watts.
That's correct.
Okay. Why do you say typically?
Because there's slight variation due to production and manufacturing.
I see. So it
It's very close to that.
could be plus or minus a certain amount?
Some tiny amount, yes.
How high has it been in production?
I don't have that data.
Can you approximate it?
I would say within a decibel of that.
And decibel means like 2.25 or 1.35 or, well, I'm not sure.
Well, it's a logarithmic scale, so it is, I would say between, on this piece of paper, I would say between 1 and 1.5 watts.
Okay. And when you talk about it being direct endpoint to the tower system, endpoint means what?
A meter
The endpoint in the meter.
is
it
the meter, yeah.
The meter. And is the endpoint even more specifically the antenna within the meter to the tower?
There's an integrated radio and meter together in that device that has a antenna on the printed circuit board itself.
Okay, but I'm just asking now also what endpoint means when you're referring to endpoint.
When
You
I
mean just-
refer to an endpoint, it is a node in the FlexNet network.
And is that also a synonym for the meter?
It is the meter, yes.
Okay. Could you point out, those are, I think the closest to you is the census meter. Isn't that correct? The other is Itron
I
digital.
haven't looked
Okay.
at them, but yes. That looks, yes.
Could,
Ours is this meter
right.
on your right side.
Is it possible for me to approach the meters and ask that something be pointed out?
Yes.
Why don't I ask the question and then maybe, excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Go ahead and ask the question.
I was thinking I'd ask the question here, then walk up and he'll have his mic, and so we won't lose audio.
The board is aware that you wish to use the meters for demonstrative purposes, so we're just not sure how that's going to work. I'm going to tell you, yes, you may approach the witness with the meter.
Okay. I'm just going to ask you from here, so the audio goes through. I want you to tell me where in the meter there the antenna is, if that's possible.
Okay?
Mr. Marcus, can one of our staff hold the meter, or do you need to point it out? Will that help? And then you can continue to ask the questions. Which meter would you like? All right. So let's try it that way and see if that works.
Could you put your finger on where the
Wait.
sorry.
Use the mic.
Could you put your finger on where the antenna is?
So there is a circuit board. There's a outer clear cover. There's an inner gray cover. The printed circuit board is underneath this inner gray cover, and it is on this side of the meter right here.
I see. So is it fair to say it's sort of just right behind the back end of the
It's
smart
not
meter?
right behind, but it's on the circuit board that is mounted underneath that gray cover, yes.
Could I,
Mr. Reed and Mr. Marcus, can I go back and have you have the witness describe where it's at so that's in the record?
yeah, could you
Right.
describe where it is and maybe approximately how far from that back, the part that the person can touch when he's looking at the meter, how far back is the antenna?
The antenna is printed on the circuit board, which is mounted underneath the gray cover that you see the display shining through or showing through. This is soldered onto that circuit board. So the circuit board is essentially mounted underneath this. So it is, I don't know how far that is, but
Okay.
it's essentially toward the front on this side.
Okay. Could I hand you my tape measure and tell me how far it is from where the antenna is to the back, where your right hand was, to the very end, before, yeah, the very back. Yeah. From there.
I would say that it is about an inch from the side.
Okay.
And I would say it's approximately an inch from the top of the glass as well.
Okay. I see. And the top of the glass is where the outside.
This plastic
yeah,
piece, yeah.
Plastic piece would be the outside of the meter.
That's right.
And how far is it, though, from, I think you said it was 1 inch down and 1
Yes.
inch, how far is it from the 1 inch down to where the wall of the residence would be, if it's affixed to the residence?
Well, so I can tell you from the back of the meter, I don't have the pan, but usually there's a solid metal pan that this mounts into on the house.
Okay.
So there's a solid metal pan, then there are lugs that these plug into. Then there's this. I can tell you I can guess. I would say probably 8 inches.
8 inches. So 8
It's an
inches.
estimate.
Yeah, an estimate of 8 inches to the wall, the outer wall of the house.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. You can put the meter back as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you.
Does census teach or train the contractors who are installing the meter in how to install it?
We do not.
Okay. Who do you leave that up to? Would that be IPL in this case?
IPL installs their meters, and they decide who they use to install them and how they train them.
And do the contractors have to communicate with you at all to get information, or?
Typically, no, unless there's some procedure that they want to use to make sure that the meter is communicating before they leave the house. But that is not typically done. I'm not sure exactly how IPL does it.
Right. Now, I understand from comments that have been made by Mr. Callisto, and he's made an application for confidentiality with respect to the manual. Is the manual or any part of the manual given to contractors to help them in their installation?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
You don't know? Okay. Do you know whether Census considers that manual confidential?
I'd have to look at it. If it says confidential in the manual, then they do.
Okay.
If it doesn't, then no.
You think that would be the test of confidentiality, as far as Census?
For that particular document, yes, not for
Okay.
anything else.
Okay.
Please try not to talk over each other. Thank you.
Does Census teach IPL personnel how to use the meters to collect information?
Yes.
And what kind of a training session is that? A week, 2 weeks? Somebody spending 1 day, or approximately?
There are a variety of different pieces. There's how to use the meter. There's how to operate the RNI. There's how to maintain the database. So some of it is ongoing with staff that helps continuously. Some of it is when it is needed.
Okay. And in terms of, we've had some testimony about a database where the information is stored. Does that software, structuring the database, if that's the right term, does that come from Census, or is this IPL's database?
It is IPL's database. We structure it, but they have the ability to modify it and augment it as they need for their particular use.
Okay. And when you structure it, what does that mean? You structure it in terms of really the columns of information in it, and?
I'm not a database expert, but that sounds reasonable. Yeah.
Okay. But there is all kinds of information, to your knowledge, that you could get from that database. Isn't that right? I mean, you could get the information for a particular household if you wanted.
It's limited to hourly consumption data, voltage information at the household. It's very high level, very low granularity.
But it is per household.
Yes.
You could get, because obviously if there are alarms, you want to know that there are alarms in a particular household.
That's right.
Okay. And you could go to that database, for a particular house pretty readily and see how many alarms there were in a particular day in the
Yes.
database. That's not difficult to do.
No, should not be.
What, in your experience, is the most common thing that would happen to cause there to be a lot of alarms in a day?
The most common thing is power failure at the house.
And does power failure at the house result in multiple messages after the power failure?
It does.
Okay. And when you say power failure at the house, so you're talking about at the house itself rather than the meter's power? The house's power.
So the meter is connected to two places. It's connected to the utility power line through a transformer. It's also connected to the house. They call it the line side and the load side. If voltage goes away at the meter, that is when we detect an outage. And we typically wait 120 seconds before we report an alarm. But after that 120 seconds, we will send in a message to the utility saying that power is lost at that residence.
I see. And when you say power is lost at the residence, you mean the meter doesn't have power, or possibly it's also the residence doesn't have power?
Well, since it's a serial chain from the utility to the meter to the house, that is true, yes.
That it could be either the meter or the house?
No, it has to be, if the meter detects a power fail, it has to be from the utility side. But because there's no power on the utility side, the house should have no power unless it has an alternative power source.
I see. So let me just recap and make sure I understand. If you get a power failure alarm, it should be that the house has no power.
That's correct.
Objection, that does not reflect what the witness said. The witness said, unless there's an alternative energy source.
Okay. And what do you mean by, stand corrected, what do you mean by an alternative energy source? A generator or something?
A generator, yeah.
Well, we've had some testimony that there have been a lot of alarms on at least a number of houses. So let's say 1,000 alarms over, about 25 alarms over 25 houses with over 1,000 alarms in a week. So you're saying in that situation, and it was explained that, the principal...
Marcus, who explained that? What testimony are you?
Mr. Bauer's testimony.
All right.
Yeah, Mr. Bauer's testimony explained that, and interrogatory 8's response, I believe, says power alarm failure, which is what you're saying is the most common thing. So you're saying in those instances, those 25 households, the power went out.
I'm sorry, I was distracted.
Well,
Can you ask that again?
Yeah, the power, if there were 25 power alarms in a week, the power went out in the house.
There's two types of power alarms. There's an alarm when the power goes out, and there's when the power is restored.
Okay. Okay.
So
Well, would it be fair to say that if the power at that household has not been experienced as going out, and all of a sudden it's going out all the time, that it's the census meter that's causing it?
it is possible for there to be a defect in the meter that would cause that.
Okay. And if that happened, you would want to remove those meters right away, correct?
We would, yes.
You wouldn't wait 2 months to do it, would you?
That's up to the utility.
Does the meter emit RF radiation at any time other than when it's transmitting a message?
No.
Okay. When the meter receives incoming message from IPL, that's done wirelessly, correct?
There are multiple ways to do that, but that is once the meter's installed, that's the primary method, yes.
Well, what other methods are there with your system?
We have a inductive serial port on the meter that you can use something we call a magnetic loop to communicate with the meter as well.
But
that requires a physical visit, so it's mostly used in the factory.
I see. So out here in the field, it is wireless communications.
For the most part, yes.
And this alternative method of communicating with the meter, is that like an Ethernet cable?
No, not
No.
at all.
Okay. Well, to get back to the question, when IPL is sending a message or maybe a query, wants some information, wants to see if the meter's alive or whatever, is that sending RF radiation to the house?
Yes.
Okay. And where is the point at which that radiation is emanating from? Maybe that's, why don't you answer that?
The top of the tower that the base station's mounted to.
Okay. So the base station near that residence, closest to that residence, would be sending the radiation to the residence?
Yes.
Okay. And is the power density of the radiation coming from the tower different from the power density of the radiation from the meter?
Yes.
And what's the power density of the radiation from the tower to the
I
residence?
don't know that number. It's dependent on distance.
I see. Is that radiation using that licensed channel of frequency that you have, or no?
Is.
It is.
It is.
But still, it's dependent on the distance, the intensity of the power density.
Yeah, any radio energy is dependent on the distance.
Okay. So that's true for the meter at the house, too, that if it's going to go 10 miles, it requires a certain amount of energy that might be greater than if it had to go.
So what's important to know about that, it's we use a licensed channel. Our other meters on the market use unlicensed channels, which means it's spectrum that everyone can use. For instance, all the Wi-Fi computers here in the office use this unlicensed channel. What it means is it has a very high noise floor. So the way to think of it is you're at a party in a crowded room and you want to talk to your friend. If it's quiet like it is in this office, I can talk very low and you can still hear me in the very back of the room because the noise floor is low. That is the advantage of our system. The low noise floor allows our system to have a very high range.
Okay.
And what it means is we can transmit far less than any other system on the market.
Do you know whether Census provides IPL with information on how many times the meters pulse or may pulse, emit radiation?
They have a configuration to set how often they would like it to transmit. They currently have it set to transmit, I believe, every 4 hours. There's some that are set to transmit every 1 hour. A low number of those.
Do you also provide the SmartPoint module that goes into the gas meter?
We do sell those. I don't know. I'm not sure if the gas meter, is that a census device? I have to ask the question, I don't know the answer.
Yeah. It's okay with me if Mr. Callisto wants to respond and tell him.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Do the gas meters emit radiation more frequently or less frequently than the electric meters, as a general rule?
As a general rule, they should be the same.
Okay. Both give off alarms and the same kind of alarms?
The alarms are different. You don't have a power fail in a gas meter.
I see. So, all other things being equal, the gas meter should radiate fewer times per week or per month or whatever.
I don't think that's true.
Okay. But the gas doesn't have a power failure.
It doesn't.
I
And hopefully your house doesn't either.
I see, because the power failure is going to be dictated largely by the house.
It's dictated by the weather, by lots of things.
Yeah.
But the utility strives to make those infrequent as possible.
In how many other states do you sell the census meters, the kind that you're selling to IPL here in Iowa?
I don't know that number or that
Is it
answer.
is it more than 5 or?
I'm
do you
sure
have-
it's more than 5, yes.
Yeah. More than 10?
Likely so, yes.
And internationally, do you also sell them?
We do.
Is Census a private company or a public company?
Census is owned by a company called Xylem, which is a public company.
Is Census the sole subsidiary of Xylem?
No, there are many subsidiaries.
What's your knowledge of fires occurring as a result of census meters in the past 5 years, for example?
I have some knowledge of it.
Could you tell me what it is?
I don't know the numbers, no.
Okay, but there are occasions when the census meters cause fires.
I wouldn't say that. Fires are typically caused in an electric meter installation because of a poor connection between the meter blades and the house, which can cause the meter to overheat.
Do you know that when apparently you don't know that when you're installing it, because otherwise you wouldn't install it if you thought there was going to be a fire.
Right. Well, the installer should look for corroded panels and have those fixed before they agree to install. But that's a training issue.
Okay.
This meter has a feature that most other meters don't have, and that is it's a safety feature built into this meter that if it were to detect that high temperature, what it does is it opens the disconnect switch in the meter automatically, which ends the possibility of the meter ever catching fire. So this is an extremely safe meter. It's safer than one that doesn't have the remote disconnect switch by far.
Well, does it eliminate the possibility of the house catching fire? I mean, the meter can be sacrificed.
With this meter, we've had 0 incidents out of millions.
Of fires in the past 5 years.
With this meter, we have had 0 fires.
I see. So in the past 5 years, if there were fires, it would be a different meter than this. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. How are they different?
One is on fire and one is not.
Can we expect anything from
Well,
that meter then?
how are the meters different?
Yeah.
This is a totally redesigned meter
I see.
that
Was it redesigned in other ways other than relating to the fire potential?
There's a variety of improvements in this meter.
Okay.
Some are for that problem, some are for other problems.
And other problems means other problems that Census has had in the past with meters.
Yeah, it's an evolution in technology.
So this technology is different than the Wisconsin technology, I take it?
Then the oldest Wisconsin meters, yes.
Was there any independent study done of this new meter by IPL, to your knowledge, before they committed to purchase it?
I believe from Mr. Bauer's testimony that is true.
That there was no
That there was.
That there was. Were you involved at all in the measurements of the power density of RF radiation given off by the census meter in response to our interrogatory to get that information?
I was.
So it was Census that had to compute that, is that correct? The power density?
Well, yes.
Okay.
And let me clarify that. We have testing data in a certain set of units, and you asked for it in a different set of units and in a different way. So to do that, we had to do additional work to provide you the numbers in the way that you asked for them.
Yeah.
Mr. Marcus, which interrogatory?
That would be interrogatory 25.
Do we
Your Honor.
have
Ye-
interrogatory, what exhibit number is it? Or where is it located in the testimony?
It's exhibit 35, Your Honor.
Mr.
Oh, Miss,
If you
I'm
tell them where
sorry.
the exhibit is.
Yeah, Mr. Reed, if you're looking for exhibit 35, you'll find it in that folder rather than the binder. I think that may be the only one in there now.
Sorry, I'm having trouble finding it.
It's the last one in that folder. I just saw you take it. It's stapled at the bottom.
Okay?
Is that the interrogatory response that you were referring to, that you provided information on?
Yes, this is it.
Um, I was going to go at this point to the manual to ask some questions. Shall we just take all that up in the confidential?
I think that that's a better place to take it up. It's possible that there could be some public questions if you have them, but if you're not comfortable with that, I think that's better and
Okay.
confidential.
That's all I have then in the public at this point.
Mr. Turner?
Mr. Reed, my name is James Turner, and I'm an attorney for Kathy Matera, and that's a consumer interest voice in this proceeding.
Morning.
Morning. I have some jumping around questions just to follow up on things that you said in your testimony a minute ago.
You mentioned the concept low granularity. Could you describe what that is?
It means that we accumulate all the power consumed by a home in a 1 hour period and send that to utility.
You send it every hour to the utility, or?
No, we accumulate it in 1 hour deep buckets, and then typically every 4 hours we send it back to the utility.
When it goes back to the utility every 4 hours, is it sent in terms that the hourly consumption can be read?
It has the current consumption and then historical data for previous hours.
So what would current consumption mean?
It is what the reading on the meter was at the top of the hour.
And then you can read every previous hour up to that. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, using the history, you can calculate what the readings were at previous hours.
Do you have any idea of what kind of information can be taken from the historical hour-by-hour usage information?
It is a measure of how many kilowatt hours were consumed by the house during that hour.
So then that would mean that they would measure how much activity was going on in the house at that time.
I don't know anything about activity. It just says that there are this many kilowatt hours consumed by the house in that hour.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that there are two sides to the meter, the line side, and what was the other side?
The load side, which is the house.
How is the meter protected or connected with the line side? I think you mentioned that.
There are 4 blades on the back of the meter. The 2 upper blades are connected to the line side. The 2 lower blades are connected to the load side.
And is the meter protected from power surges from the load side?
It doesn't distinguish between line and load in terms of surge. There are protection devices in the meter for surges.
Could you describe those?
There are devices called a metal oxide varistor, MOV. There are different ones.
What level of surge does on the load side does the meter protect against?
Like I said, since it's basically a single conductor that goes from both sides. So what it does is, I think if the voltage exceeds 720 volts on the, it will try to shunt that.
From either side? And you're saying
In the meter, it
in the
doesn't distinguish between line and load.
So it doesn't matter to the meter whether the surge comes from the line side or the load side?
I don't know what could cause it on the load side, but yeah, you're correct.
You're saying that you don't think there could be a surge on the load side?
I don't think there could be a surge on the load side that wasn't caused by the line side.
I see. I want to understand how this works in relation to the utility. Can the utility turn off the meter from the home office?
What does off mean to you?
Stop functioning. Can it stop it from functioning?
The two things that the utility can do is they can open the switch so that disconnects the house. The other thing they can do is they can set it so that it doesn't emit energy. They can't turn off the computer or the meter itself.
It would keep functioning in either of those instances?
Yes.
Is it accurate to say that the meter is a computer?
There is a microprocessor inside the meter.
Is it possible for the computer or for the meter to be hacked by some kind of an external source, such as ham radio or some other source?
No.
And how is that prevented?
It is the radio. There's multiple layers. Is the answer?
We asked yesterday about security from any kind of terrorism activity or any other kind of hacking, and they said you would explain that to us. So could you explain how the meter is made secure from any kind of intervention by a third party?
There is no commercial radio that can communicate with this device. The individual radio transmissions use a proprietary modulation that no other radio uses, something we call 7-level FSK. On top of that, the data itself is scrambled, and then it is encoded, and then it is also each message is protected with a 32-bit cyclical redundancy check. Cyclical redundancy check.
And
CRC is probably what you're used to seeing.
I'll remind the witness and counsel what my client just testified to is all public testimony. There was some exchange of data requests that got into confidential information. What we just heard was essentially from his testimony.
I'm sorry, say that again.
What we just heard was essentially public information from his testimony. There was some data exchanged in data request responses that was confidential. So I'll ask you not to testify about confidential issues in this session.
And none of this was confidential, is that right? Yeah.
Correct.
I have another, there may be more questions about that in confidential, I don't know for sure. You mentioned nodes. Could you, again, just state what a node is in your system?
I don't think I said the word node, but the primary components of the network are the base station tower and the endpoints, I think is the word we used, which is the meter itself.
Are there repeaters in the system?
Typically not, no.
What is
although a meter can repeat data for another meter. Any meter can do that.
And I understood you to say that you're operating, you're working as you build the system out to eliminate the buddy system framework as much to.
We try to put enough tower infrastructure so that using buddy mode is not required.
What would be the power infrastructure for that?
It means that you put enough towers in a service territory so that you don't have to use other meters to repeat data.
So that the idea is that to stop the repeaters, you create more bases at the towers, or more towers with bases.
That is a way to eliminate having to use the buddy system, yes.
So what is your concern about the buddy system? Why do you want to eliminate it?
Because it causes network traffic. One of the things that my company wants to optimize is minimize traffic on the channel so that there's not competition between meters to get the data back. The RF channel that we use is a finite resource, and eliminating messages on the channel means you have more bandwidth to do to receive messages from the meters.
When you're when you're making your decisions about improving the system, do you consider a way of reducing the amount of RF that a consumer in a household is exposed to?
We do. We have less energy emitted than any other system on the market. To give, to answer that question more fully, for example, I see lots of folks have cell phones and computers that have Wi-Fi on. If you used your cell phone or your Wi-Fi device for 6 minutes, using the typical meter that we heard yesterday from Mr. Bauer, that even in untuned, it is transmitting 11 pulses per day. It means that in 6 minutes, that is much energy or as many transmission time that the meter uses in an entire year. So it's a very, very small amount of airtime and number of transmissions that the device uses.
When you move in the direction of reducing the buddy system, does that increase or decrease the amount of energy that's an individual is exposed
The
to?
amount of energy sent by the meter is constant. It will reduce the number of times that it transmits or pulses.
And that means that it goes back, there are more bases, basically, is what you're saying. That's how you reduce the buddy system.
Yes, that's done before the meters are installed. It's a design time issue.
Are there any other repeaters besides meters and the base at the tower? Are there any other things that would send energy or messages?
They're not.
Okay. Do you have a process for integrating the system that you're putting out with the local zoning laws?
That's the utility's responsibility.
I may have asked this before, but I want to refine it just slightly. Can you tell by the amount of electricity measured by the electricity use measured by the meter, how much activity is going on in the home?
I don't know a way to do that. No.
Is there any relationship between those two?
It's just a measurement of power consumed. It's completely undifferentiated.
That's true. Well, let me ask you this. If you're measuring more energy at some point than another point, would that suggest to you that there's more activity going on in the household at the second point?
It indicates to me that the house is consuming more power.
Okay, I think that's it. We have no further questions.
Board Member Wagner. Board Member Lozier.
I have just a couple questions that I'd like to clarify in my mind. I'm sure it's clear in your mind. So you talked about the meters being connected wirelessly to the towers, right?
That's right.
And the meters transmit signals to the towers.
Yes.
And your testimony, I believe, says that it will transmit up to 10 miles. Is that right?
That is a very broad, I mean, it's dependent on terrain and,
Right.
and lots of different factors, but that is a good typical number, yes.
Okay. And so the base stations at the towers collect this data from the meters, correct?
Correct.
And what does the base station do with that information?
It is, it doesn't even interpret it or do anything with the data other than pass it on to the regional network interface.
And how is that done?
It is typically a secure internet connection or direct. It's a Ethernet connection, internet connection of some sort to the regional network interface.
Okay. And ultimately, it winds up at IPL, I assume.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Reed, have you ever testified before a commission or a board prior to today?
No, Your Honor.
In your testimony on page 3, and in conversations with Mr. Marcus and Mr. Turner, you were asked about minimizing traffic or you stated that your company worked to minimize traffic on channels. Could further reduction of the transmittals further minimize traffic?
Yes, we have a process we call tuning, which Mr. Bauer mentioned, and as we tune the meter, the ultimate goal would be for it to transmit its number of times that it's set to transmit per day, which I believe is 6 for the vast majority of meters. Once every 4 hours.
Did you say that's the minimum that you can transmit?
It's programmable. That's what the meters are programmed to transmit.
So you could program it to transmit less frequently?
You can, but the system, the utility is interested in getting the hourly reads and not missing hourly reads, so they have a complete set of data. That is the optimum number of messages to ensure that they get all of the hourly reads for the meter back.
And I understand that, but my question to you is, can it be programmed for less frequency?
Yes.
How much less? Like monthly, quarterly?
I don't know what the lowest is. It's several hours, maybe daily.
Do you
There's
know?
also a mode where it doesn't transmit at all. Would be the minimum.
I hear you saying that it could transmit at the amount that's currently being proposed, 6 + 1, so 7 times per day,
Yes.
or not at all.
There and more or less. There's several settings.
And the programming and the amount of transmittals is determined by IPL.
Correct.
Have you ever worked with a utility where they had customers who wished to continue with an analog meter?
I have not.
What would be the difference between an analog meter and one of your meters that transmitted once a month?
Our meter will typically be much more accurate, but functionally, it is the same. If you're having a meter reader read a analog meter once a month and getting one transmittal a month from our meter, I can see that those are analog. Those are the same.
And can a meter, an individual meter, be programmed differently than, strike that. If you have two homes that sit next to each other and they both are on one of your meters,
Yes.
can one meter be programmed not to transmit and another be set up so that it has the 6+1 transmittals per day?
It can.
Is that able to be programmed for an entire community in that manner?
Yes.
Would the utility be able to obtain the same information only on a monthly basis?
If they did a demand read once a month, they could perform that, yes.
Would they then be required to have a meter reader?
If they were able to get all the demand reads, they would not. If they could not, then they would need a reader.
I heard you testify that you are fairly certain that any information collected by your company is protected and that no other third party can or other entity can get that information. Is that an accurate reflection of your testimony?
It is.
Do you have the ability to control separate contracts or agreements that are entered into by IPL?
We do not.
Is it possible that IPL could enter into a contract where that information was shared with others?
I'm really not qualified to answer that. I don't know what agreements IPL has, but it is IPL's data. I will stipulate that.
And then finally, how do you spell xylem?
XYLEM.
Board Member Wagner?
Thank you, Mr. Reed. I haven't had a chance, excuse me, to go through the test report completely. In that testing, was the meter tested with the functions off for any radiation emittance?
It is tested with the meter functional, but it is not, that test, the purpose of that test is not part of the FCC testing of the functionality of the radio. It's to say while our meter is operating, we don't put extra noise on the power lines or emit energy in other bands than the ones that we're intended to radiate in.
So if a meter is in the no transmit mode, how much radiation does it emit?
It's indicated in that test procedure, but it's very, very low.
Okay.
And it's orders of magnitude less than indicated by the testimony I saw from Mr. Bathgate. And if you look on every device, there's a sticker that says that this device has been tested to Part 15 of the FCC communications rules, that we don't cause extra energy conducted or emitted.
And you referenced Mr. Bathgate's testimony. In your experience, do you have any ideas for why the numbers are different in that test report than from this, or from their testing than
yes,
from this?
I do. So when you're connected to a power line, it's kind of like being in a communal pool. Anything that's in the pool is in the pool. So any other device connected to that power line, any other thing affecting that power line is going to be on the power line. And to say that what you see on the scope is caused by one device on that power line or one person in the swimming pool is impossible.
So you're saying in the ANAB test report, the meter was isolated from all other
That's right.
sources?
It was correctly filtered. The power was filtered so that no outside energy was on the power line. And we were able to verify that the meter does not cause any of those issues at all.
In Mr. Bathgate's tests, that was not done?
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Reed, I have one more question. If you could look at your testimony on the screen, line 3, the question, how often does the FlexNet system transmit? If you were asked to answer this question with programming inclusion of the buddy system, what would your answer be if you're able to provide the same?
As I mentioned before, our goal is to drive the buddy system to 0 transmits. So your question is subjective in those terms. I don't know how, we want to have, for the network to operate correctly, we want to have a very small percentage of meters in that buddy mode, less than 5%, for example. So maybe that could, and the way the system operates is, and you'd asked this question yesterday, Your Honor. The way the system operates is the meter transmits a message that any meter around it can hear, and what it does is it will repeat the message to the tower. When the tower hears it, after a certain delay, after the tower hears it, it sends it a message back immediately saying, any other meter that wants to send this message back to the tower, you don't need to, we've got it, we're good. So typically it causes one extra message from not the meter that transmitted the message originally, but from the repeating meter.
I don't claim to be an expert in technology, and I am not an engineer. Explain to me how the buddy mode works if it's trying to find another meter and it can't find one.
It doesn't try at all. What it does is we have 2 channels that we operate on. One is typically from the meter to the tower. One is from the tower to the meter.
That's what he said.
So meters have receivers that are listening for messages from the tower. So if a meter decides to use this buddy mode, what it does is it transmits on the channel that goes from the tower to the meter, which other meters are listening on. So any other meter in range, not a particular meter, it doesn't have to try, it just sends it out and hopes that another meter hears it. When all those, let's say 10 meters hear that message, we have an algorithm that says the one that is closest to that meter, and that closeness is decided by how strong the radio message it heard, the strength of the radio message. Meaning, if it's closer, it should be stronger. If it's further, it should be weaker. So if it's closer, what it will try to do is repeat that message sooner to the tower. When the tower hears that, it responds back that I got the buddy message from the first meter. Everybody else that's waiting to repeat this message, please don't repeat it anymore. It's done.
Thank you for that. And what is the range of the meters again?
It is typically.
Is that that's not a confidential?
It's not confidential.
Okay.
It is typically about 10 miles. It can go further or less depending on terrain.
Do either of you have any other questions? Mr. Callisto?
Just a few redirect, Your Honor, and then I also will, I think, upon hearing the testimony and the questions, move in and exhibit through this witness rather than through Dr. Wahlberg.
Mr. Clisto, did I hear you correctly that you have another exhibit for this individual?
I do, Your Honor. I thought I was going to put it in through Dr. Valberg, but I think it makes sense because of a follow-up question I want to have with this witness.
So it may also make sense for the confidential session, just for you to bring it up now, but just know that if any party has a question related to that exhibit, that I will go back through the parties.
That's fine.
All right?
Thank you. Mr. Reed, you had some questions as we started off the session today from Mr. Marcus, and he was walking you through some measurements with the census meter. Do you recall that?
I do.
And I think at the end of that process, you testified that the antenna, which is on the circuit board, is, in the hypothetical, you had about 8 inches to the outer wall of the house. Is that accurate?
Yes, through the metal meter pan, yes.
Regardless of the distance from the outer wall of the house, do the Stratus and Census products comply with all FCC requirements?
They do.
And Your Honor, I would like, if you don't mind, to have that meter presented back to him.
I could reach it if it helps. Okay.
Mr. Reed, I'd like
I
you
don't want
to,
you to fall out of the witness box, so we'll just...
I would like you to read off of that meter the statement about FCC compliance.
So there are 2 things about FCC compliance. One is that the radio complies with every FCC rule. There's also a rule that all digital electronic devices have to comply with, and that's the statement that's on the meter. It says this device complies with Part 15 of the FCC rules. Operation is subject to the following 2 conditions. 1, this device may not cause harmful interference, and 2, this device must accept any interference received, including interference that may cause undesired operation.
Thank you. You had some questions from Mr. Marcus about power density, specifically 1.25 watts. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do recall that.
Okay. I would like to present to you what is a single page from Dr. Havis's rebuttal testimony. It's page 29. Or you can read it off of the screen. Thank you. If you could push it up a little bit further, just so we have that full chart. So, Mr. Reed, what's on the screen before you is page 29 of Matara Havis rebuttal testimony. You're familiar with this chart?
I am.
And you see that it states the top, on the left side, power density?
Yes.
And is that power density represented in this chart as a continuous emission from the meter?
That testing is done with a continuous amount of energy injected into the antenna. That is not how the device operates in the real world. Like I mentioned previously, it transmits very, very infrequently. It transmits, the example I gave was that if you use a wireless device for 6 minutes, it's as much on airtime as our meter transmits in an entire year using the 11 messages per day that IPL reported that they are seeing currently in the IPL service territory.
And even if your device transmitted all the time, would it still be compliant with FCC regulations?
If it transmitted continuously instead of the very infrequent amount that it does, it would still be 100% compliant with the FCC regulations and legal.
Your Honor, we marked yesterday the document as IPL 215. You had asked me to present that document at the right time in front of a witness. This is the one that I referenced earlier. I thought I would put it in through through Dr. Valberg, but I think it's more appropriate and timely through Mr. Reed. Everybody should have a copy of it. I don't believe there's one for the witness. I can certainly give him my copy.
Is this it?
Just give us a moment.
I think I have it. Is this it?
That's it. Is that marked 215?
It doesn't have a number, but
Make sure it's the same one. I'm pretty sure it is. Yeah, thank you.
Oh.
Just take a second to refresh yourself with that document, please.
Mr. Vanderstreek, would you please go, this is off the record, will you please go meet the state troopers? We accidentally, maybe. You may proceed.
So, Mr. Reed, I've presented in front of you what's been marked as IPL Exhibit 215. It is a series of documents all stapled together. Are you familiar with these documents?
yes.
And what are these documents?
These documents related to FCC approval and testing for different subparts of the FCC regulation.
And these were submitted to the FCC?
Some of these are submitted, some of them are done internally and kept locally to present on demand to the FCC.
I'm going to direct your attention, strike that, let me move the document into evidence first, Your Honor. These are FCC submitted documents, and they show, as the witness has testified to here, as an offer of proof, compliance with the FCC rules. This, again, is an issue that I think is front and center for this case. They're government documents, and I believe they should be before the board.
Mr. Cook?
I'm
Mr.
gonna-
Schuling?
I don't have a problem with it being entered. I have a problem if there's going to be essentially additional direct examination and testimony because we didn't have the opportunity to prepare for this. So I don't know how far Mr. Calesto is going to go with this. I would object to this being an additional and new line of testimony of this witness. I have no problems with the admission of the exhibit.
Mr. Marcus?
I would just ask Mr. Reed one question.
Mike, turn your green light.
Yeah. This letter of authorization, Exhibit 215, it relates to FCC compliance of the...
Mr. Marcus, are you asking me the question?
Mr. Reed's.
Okay, we'll come back around to you on that. Do you have any objection to the admission of the exhibit?
No, I don't.
Mr. Turner?
I do not have objection, but there are many issues about the FCC rule that will be opened up by this, and we will want to. What I am concerned about is the continuous characterization of Mr. Bathgate's testimony. They're alleging things about what it means and how it works. I'd like to have that. I assume, as you said before, you'll recognize that. We do not object to this coming in, but it does open a set of other issues that,
And the board recognizes that IPL is opening that line of questioning, since you've not had an opportunity to have anyone provide testimony. You will be granted the broad discretion to ask questions related to the same. Mr. Colesto, based upon the comments of the parties, the Exhibit 215 is admitted. You may proceed.
I'll direct your attention, and I'm sorry the documents are not numbered. There is one that is, it's labeled Certification Exhibit. It's about 10 pages down. The top is Certification Exhibit, and the bottom part of that page says RF exposure.
So, can you, I have page numbers.
I don't believe, you may not have the same document in front of you. They're periodically paginated, but not consecutively.
I have it now. Thank you.
So that's it right there. Thank you. And the bottom of this page reflects, does it not, Mr. Reed, that this is a test for RF exposure? I'm sorry, that's not the right page up on the screen.
Teresa, just page through them from page 1 and have him identify exactly what page it is. Mr. Clisto, I assume you're going to tell us to stop when we get there.
I know which one he's going for. I'll tell him to stop.
I think that's it.
I don't believe it is.
No?
At the bottom of that page, it should say RF exposure. Keep going. There, that's it. The next page.
So, Mr. Reed, and if we could go to the next page then, please. Thank you. What does this certification exhibit show to the FCC?
There are guidelines for RF exposure that is typically called MPE, or maximum permissible exposure, I believe is what the acronym stands for. And we have to certify that when transmitting at maximum power, we are in compliance with FCC regulations. And this test document shows that the device complies with the maximum permissible exposure requirements, provide an adequate separation between the device and any radiation structure and the general population.
And I would just ask that the page be pushed up a little bit for that conclusion to be shown. No further questions on this document. Mr. Reed, you had a question from Mr. Turner as well as the chair concerning the buddy system. Is use of the buddy system compliant with all FCC rules, including on RF and conducted energy?
It is fully compliant. the reduction in the use of buddy mode isn't to, it is, the benefit is that it causes less energy to be on the channel and more airtime to be available to send data. The optimization of the resource of the channel.
And I'm going to direct your attention to what is now IPL Exhibit 216, the other FCC certification document that you have. Your attention was brought to this by Commissioner Wagner.
Okay.
And on page 5 of 31 of that document, please describe the scope of the tests that were conducted and what was being tested.
So this is the Class B digital device that any consumer device has to go through to ensure that it doesn't radiate conducted, meaning it doesn't put extra energy on the power line that it's connected to, and it doesn't radiate energy in frequencies that it should radiate in. So this conducted measurement, conducted Class B in the first column, shows energy for different frequency ranges and the limits that are maximally permissible. Later in the document, we show that we are far below these numbers, and these numbers on this page, even though they're in a power measurement called dB microvolts, are orders of magnitude below what was reported in the Bathgate testimony, for example.
And does this testing address the full range of issues that the interveners are referring to as dirty energy?
I believe that it does, yes.
And then one final question. The chair had a dialogue with you concerning the ability of the census meters to pulse on different schedules. Do you recall those questions and answers with the chair?
Yes.
And just to make clear for the record, there's a distinction between the collection function of energy from the home and the ability to transmit that to the tower, correct?
That's correct.
So a meter could still collect on an hourly basis if that was required, but transmit that on any number of pre-programmable schedules.
That's correct.
No further questions.
So the board is going to take a 15 to 20-minute recess to allow the parties to contemplate the information that's been provided. When we return, I am going to ask you if you believe that you need additional time related to the additional information that's been provided. I will provide each of you with the opportunity to go back through and ask this witness any questions that you have related to the document, the exhibit that's been admitted. Is there any questions related to that? Are there any questions related to that? Okay, the board will recess for 15 minutes till 10:20 or until all three board members have returned. Yes, the witness on the stand is Mr. Mark Reed. Mr. Schuling, you may proceed. Mr. Cook, you may proceed.
OCA has no additional questions concerning Exhibit 215.
Mr. Marcus, do you have any questions for this witness?
I was going to let Mr. Turner go first, if that's okay.
That is fine. Mr. Turner?
I wanted to make a comment just before questioning. Technically speaking, we have no questions about 215. The problem we have is that it's being used to characterize Mr. Bathgate's testimony and being presented as an alternative, as a rebuttal. But Mr. Bathgate's testimony actually is concerning Exhibit 216. And there are issues in 216 that are not addressed here. I can ask some questions, but it would need to be in the context of understanding that our view is nothing that's been said here about radio transmissions through the FCC actually address what we would call conductive transmission.
So, Mr. Turner, I recognize that they've brought this in rebuttal to the other testimony that you've had. Since you do not have the opportunity to bring another witness and address the exhibit that's being presented, and it isn't against your witness, you may ask any of those questions of this witness.
Well, let me ask a few questions and then just say that, okay, I can just ask a few questions and they'll be partly relevant. And then other issues will be raised when Mr. Bathgate testifies that are important. In conducting this test, how far away from the transmission point were your instruments or whatever you use to measure the output?
Which
whatever it is that you're talking about in the 216, in the 215.
So the conducted, like you mentioned, I agree with your comment that 216 is what deals with the conducted energy testing.
Okay, that's the. Now the next question is just now on just 215 and the testimony you gave on 215. Does that, what you were discussing and explaining, is that, I'm going to start out with congruent with the manual that Census uses in its, that we were provided as evidence?
Could you?
What I want to know is, one of the issues that we would have to investigate, because we just got this, is to compare what they claim to have done in the manual versus what they claim to have done in the testimony versus what was in fact in the FCC guideline or the FCC rule.
I think that's so could we go to the manual? Do I have that?
We cannot go to the manual because it's confidential.
So we can do that. We can ask that question in the confidential.
Well,
Yes.
what I will say is in the manual specifically says.
I'm going to stop you. Do not say anything that's in the manual because it's confidential.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about that in confidential session. You'll be free to testify about it there. Thank you.
I actually believe that what I wanted to know I've gotten answered, which is that the issue we were discussing primarily, there are a few others similar to it, but conductive transmission, and I think the witnesses agreed that that's more appropriate for 216. As far as 215 is concerned, we have no concern that isn't, that's what the FCC requires, and they met that requirement, we assume, and that's fine. It's just not relevant to anything that we're talking about.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Mr. Marcus?
Yes, Mr. Reed, yeah, just to make sure that I'm understanding it the same way. So 215, which Mr. Callisto asked you about, deals with radio frequency radiation through the air and not conductive emissions, correct?
I need to clarify that a little bit. The 216 also deals with on-air emissions as well. What 215 is, these are a collection of documents that my company submits to the FCC to get type approval for the specific radio in the box. And it doesn't deal with spurious emissions that a Class B or Part 15 electronic device for a consumer would relate to.
Okay, and by spurious emissions, you mean the conductive emissions that Mr. Bathgate was talking
Both
about?
conducted and radiated.
Okay, okay. So this 215 document then deals with RF frequency and put out by the census meter, the census stratus meter, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Has nothing to do with the Itron meter the Itron digital meter that Mr. Bathgate measured for conductive emissions, correct?
Does not.
Okay. And 216, which we haven't had any discussion about, I think I'm not sure, has 216 been admitted?
Yes.
Okay. 216 is really some third-party test of conductive emissions that census arranged dealing with the census meter, correct?
Conducted and radiated.
Okay. I have no further questions.
Do any of the board members have any questions? Mr. Callisto?
No further questions?
It is my intent to go into closed session at this point in time for Mr. Reed and Mr. Bauer. We're going to start with Mr. Reed. IPL is responsible for making sure that anyone that is left in the room is in the room that is allowed to be in the room. It's your responsibility to determine who's not. We will take the live streaming down. I anticipate that we will not go back into live streaming until after we've had lunch. That's my anticipation of the closed session materials. I could be wrong. But my intent is to come back in after lunch and have lunch sometime between the hours of 11:30 and 12:30 in that time period. Is there any objection to that process? Mr. Schuling?
No objection.
Mr. Marcus?
No objections.
Mr.
No
Attorney?
objection.
None.
Okay. The other item that I am going to try and do is I want to handle exhibits 215 and 216 in closed session at the same time as much as possible. We'll go through those with any questions you have as they relate to 215 and 216 in closed session. If it doesn't work, we'll modify it, but that's my intent. And Mr. Greivaldine, you need to make sure, or Mr. Callisto, make sure. So we will move into closed session. We'll take about a 10-minute break, 5-minute. We're not going anywhere, so thank you.
No objection.
No objection.
No objection. IPL Exhibit 217 is admitted into the record.
Mr. Bauer, were you here during the testimony of Mr. Dave Vogensen yesterday?
Yes, I was.
And during that testimony, Board Member Wagner asked Mr. Vogensen about the customer doing self-reads and the two verification reads and whether there were alternatives to be considered. Do you recall that?
I do recall that.
I would like to hand out an exhibit which has been previously provided to the parties, in which we have marked as IPL Exhibit 218. The parties have stipulated that they do not object to this being admitted.
I do want to make a clarification. That's not my, I have no objection, but I have a qualification on that.
Correct. There was no objection to the exhibit being added to the record, was my understanding.
Yes, if I just have an opportunity to address that sometime,
Mr. Schuling, do you want that opportunity right now?
that'd be fine. I have no objection to IPL providing an additional estimated read proposal. The fact that I don't object to it and allowing it to come into the record doesn't mean that I agree that this is what should be used by the board in this particular case.
May I proceed?
Hearing no objection, but with the qualification, the exhibit, IPL Exhibit 218 is admitted.
Thank you. Mr. Bauer, can you describe 218 and why IPL is offering this into the record?
Certainly. So what the proposal would be the company would conduct 4 verification reads per year, once per quarter. Customers would receive estimated bills 8 times per year, or so in other words, in a sequence, there'd be 2 estimated bills, a verification read, 2 estimated bills, a verification read. We would also review the proposed $15 fee and update it as appropriate in the next rate case. And as we listened to some of Board Member Wagner's concerns yesterday, we went back and huddled and looked for, were there alternatives that we could consider that would maybe move away from the self-read, and this is our proposal.
Thank you. I have no further questions, but Mr. Bauer is available for cross.
Mr. Schuling.
I have no cross questions. Thank you.
Mr. Marcus, Mr. Turner, who is going first?
I am.
Mr. Marcus.
Thank you. Mr. Bauer, is this your new proposal? Is this kind of an amendment to the tariff, and this is your new suggestion?
It's not an amendment to the filing. It is in response to Board Member Wagner's concerns or requests. Were there alternatives?
I see. So it's something you're seriously considering, is that it?
We would be amenable to this, yes. We would be amenable to this, yes.
And the reading 4 times a year, every 3rd month, is that going to be just a meter reader, a lower price person, or a customer service rep?
Mr. Marcus, at this point, I don't know. This came about yesterday, and there'd be obviously some logistics to think about in terms of what that might look like.
Okay. On Exhibit 217, I think previously in Exhibit 3, the total for gas and electric, the maximum number of transits per week was 5,913, correct?
Yes,
Okay, now it's 11,538.
yes.
And the reason was just that there was a lot to look at, and,
Yeah, somehow in the data query, we just missed that number.
normally the computer does the math, though, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Were you, when you went back, were you able to determine more precisely than when we last talked about it, the number of ones, at least for that weekly period?
I don't recall whether we have the number of ones or not.
Okay? I have some other questions not related to those exhibits. I'd like to go to it's the end of exhibit, material rebuttal exhibit C, the portion that follows the confidential information. This is the MPEs. If you could go to page 145, please.
I don't have that document in front of me.
I think they'll just put it up. Although,
Approach, Honor.
Yes.
I have the page in front of me.
there's, oh. Turn it around. Oh. Okay. Could you scroll down a little bit more? Do you see the paragraph beginning under normal operation?
Yes?
Okay, would you read that?
Under normal operation of the meter, the transmitter should never obtain a duty cycle of more than 3 messages every 6 seconds. The worst case scenario for transmitter operation will occur when the endpoint relays a message it receives from another meter. This is referred to as message pass or buddy mode.
So that is contemplating that there could be quite a lot on a regular basis. It says under normal operation, shouldn't obtain a duty cycle of 3 messages every 6 seconds.
Mr. Marcus, can I get you to,
Sorry, I got it.
thank you.
Did you see that prior to, prior to this docket coming up? That portion of the manual?
Did I see what?
That paragraph that you just read?
I don't recall whether I did or not.
Okay. If you saw that, that would have probably stood out in your mind, though, wouldn't it?
Not particularly.
Well, it's contemplating a message every 2 seconds, correct?
And so, would I have looked at it in that?
Actually, I'm going to object. That's not what it states.
Well, it says it should never obtain a duty cycle of more than that, but clearly,
Mr. Marcus,
okay,
restate your question, and if you want to pull something from the exhibit, have the witness read the same.
okay. Okay, well, I'll move on, but you didn't happen to notice anything that particularly triggered in your mind that you better check this out?
Well, as you go through the tuning process, you're concerned about meters that are transmitting via the buddy mode, and as Mr. Reed testified earlier this morning, you attempt to remove those, diminish those, and remove them. But I didn't read it in the manual. You're dealing with it on more of an exception reporting basis. Why is this meter transmitting this frequently?
Okay. But you see that paragraph says under normal operation. It's not just contemplating initial deployment.
But I think you're also mischaracterizing a little bit, because you need to move on and say the transmitter should never obtain a duty cycle of 3 transmitted messages every 6 seconds. I think I'm just going to stop there.
Okay. Would you go also to page 153?
Okay?
Okay. So this is now, if you see at the top, the other, you may not have noticed it, was electric meters. This is a section dealing with gas meters.
Yes, I'm fully aware of the differences.
Okay. If you go to the last 4 lines, maybe you could read that, beginning here, normally.
Where at again?
Yeah, sorry.
Normally, the transmitter will transmit no more than once every 15 minutes. Per N, usually this rate is on the order of once every 4 hours or greater, period. Thus, commissioning of the unit operating in boost mode will be the basis of the following calculation.
Okay. So, how do you understand that sentence? Normally, the transmitter will transmit no more than once every 15 minutes. That's something like 95 or 96 a day, correct?
Here again, I think you're taking this a little bit out of context, because you have to move on and say usually this rate is on the order of once every 4 hours or greater.
Well, how do you...
This is a setting.
Yeah.
As Mr. Reed testified to, there are various settings that these meters can be set to transmit at. We've chosen to set our gas meters at once every 4 hours.
Okay. You don't know that those 4 lines have anything to do with how you set it, do you?
Having what?
How you set it, how you program it. You don't really know that. You're advocating a theory of what that may be.
Well, I know what we have the meters set at, and I mean, this lays out the potential range of alternatives. What I know is what we have our meters set to transmit at.
Okay. Well, okay, but even when you set it, obviously with 11,000 in a week, there can be significant deviations.
And we don't disagree with that there are a minuscule amount of meters that transmit more than the design parameters. And as I also previously testified to, we are in the tuning mode, and we acknowledge there are probably more transmissions in the tuning mode than what there will be when the system is fully deployed and fully tuned.
Okay. I have no further questions.
Mr. Turner?
I have a few questions. Mr. Bauer, on Exhibit 218, the one we just talked about, I might have misheard, but I don't think you went to the final expansion of non-standard meter alternative point on that.
I think you're probably right, Mr. Turner. I probably did not. And so what that says is that any customer who is on the hold list as of November 6th with an AMI meter, the company would go back and offer a non-standard metering alternative, assuming they meet the qualifications of what the non-standard meter alternative is.
Have you made any final determination on whether analog meters might be included in that non-standard?
Our proposal is digital meters.
Okay. Then I have a question with regard to the Bauer rebuttal testimony,
Okay.
Page 17.
Okay?
On line 20,
Okay.
could you read the heading there that is starting at line 20? I guess it's item 6.
Yes, HFC 35C and HFE 35C spectrum analyzers cannot properly measure the narrow range of radio frequency from IPL's AMI meters.
Now, that says a spectrum analyzer.
Yes.
Is this actually a spectrum analyzer, the HF35C and HFE 35C? Are those actually spectrum analyzers, or are they RF analyzers?
I believe the label on the box says those are spectrum analyzers, I believe.
Okay. Now, the language on the back, or the page 18, let's go to the second. Let's go to line 14.
Okay.
And could you read line that's I guess a package insert for the HFE 35C.
Detects RF radiation generated by cellular phone and cordless phones, DECT, microwave ovens, radar, wireless communication devices, such as internet routers, WLAN, Wi-Fi, baby monitors, Bluetooth, video games, smart meters, cell phone towers in the operational range of 27 megahertz at 2.7 gigahertz with the UBB27 antenna, GSM UMTS 2G, 3G, 4G.
So that would be an RF radiation analyzer, is what that refers to. I'm asking you, do you have anything in writing or that says it's a spectrum analyzer, or you're just recalling from the box?
The data contained in these indented portions of my testimony are directly off of the user's manual or off of the box label. I don't recall which that was.
Okay, and they talk about RF radiation.
That's true of the HFE 35C.
Okay. Then one final question is, when you looked at the various meters, there are 3 kinds of meters I think we're talking about. Did you look at or compare and contrast the health concerns that are raised about analog meters versus the health concerns raised about the RF smart meter?
Don't know I understand your question.
Did you look at the health concerns that are raised by any of these meters? Was the health concern ever part of your consideration?
Well, we've looked at numerous studies, numerous conclusions by reputable organizations that conclude that digital meters, smart meters, there are not health issues with those.
So then the question I asked was, did you compare health concerns that are raised about analog meters versus health concerns that are raised by RF meters?
No.
Those are all the questions I have.
Do either of the board members have any questions?
Very briefly. Mr. Bauer, do analog meters emit radio frequency?
They do not.
Do digital meters emit radio frequency?
I don't believe they do. If they do, it's a very minute quantity. Because a digital meter that's a non-AMI meter does not have a sending communication device in it to send.
Tell me what an AMR meter is.
Okay. So an AMR meter, we had a little discussion yesterday about ERT meters. An AMR meter would be similar to an ERT meter in that what happens with that is it is typically a one-way communication device that resides on the meter. Most commonly what happens is there's a receiving unit in a meter reader vehicle, and they drive down the street, and it sends a signal that wakes that AMR meter up. That AMR meter transmits the consumption data, not interval data, just consumption data, to that receiving unit that's in that vehicle. That goes back, and then that's downloaded into a data center, and it's processed for billing.
So that's an alternative way of reading meters, I take it?
It is.
Thank you.
I'm good. I'm good.
I have
Okay.
no further questions.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Mr. Greiveldinger?
I have no redirect.
Mr. Bauer? You may step down.
Thank you.
Did any of the parties have any discussion, or did you leave it up to my discretion as to which witness to call next?
We didn't have any further discussion. I think we're leaving it up to your discretion.
All right. Mr. Marcus or Mr. Turner, do you have a preference as to whether or not Mr. Wahlberg goes before Mr. Bathgate or vice versa?
Well, Mr. Bathgate, I think, is prepared to come back. Excuse me. And we would like to have, if we could, Dr. Magda Davis, who's from Canada. That she would find it more inconvenient to come back.
Yes, but I don't have a, when is the plane flight I have to worry about for her?
It's not the flight, it's coming back and some medical care that she requires.
Okay, but she's available at any time today.
Yes.
Okay. IPL, you may call your next witness.
IPL calls Dr. Peter Wahlberg.
Can we stipulate to this before? This is Exhibit 45. Prior to Dr. Valberg, we are going to stipulate to the admission of Exhibit 45.
Mr. Marcus,
Yes.
hold on one second. Let me swear the witness in, and then I'll come to you. Mr. Wahlberg, would you please raise your right arm? Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is true and accurate? You may be seated. Mr. Marcus, what was your question?
We just agreed to stipulate to the admission of an exhibit. It was one that I may ask Dr. Valberg about, and I would like to get it admitted into evidence now. It's Exhibit 45.
Is there any objection to admission of Exhibit 45?
No.
OCA has no objection.
Hearing no objection, hearing Exhibit 45 is admitted. Mr. Greiveldinger, you may Mr. Callisto, you may proceed.
Please state your name and spell your last name.
Peter Wahlberg, that's V-A-L-B-E-R-G.
And Dr. Wahlberg, did you cause to be filed in this case both direct and rebuttal testimony?
Yes.
And do you have any corrections to make to your testimony?
Yes, I have one correction on page 14 of my pre-filed testimony, line 17.
Direct testimony, correct?
Yes, this is my this is my direct testimony, and on line 17, the text says, "Moreover, IR classifications are made with reference to the quantity of exposure. The correct statement is IR classifications are made without reference to the quantity of exposure. So the change of the word with to without.
What paragraph, line was that? What line was that, Dr. Valberg?
Line 17
Thank you.
at the very end.
This is your direct or your rebuttal?
Direct.
And with that change, Dr. Wahlberg, if you were asked the same questions today, would you give the same answers in your pre-filed testimony?
Yes, I would.
Dr. Wahlberg is available for cross.
Mr. Cook?
OCA has no questions for Dr. Valberg.
Mr. Marcus, Mr. Turner. Mr. Marcus?
Good afternoon, Dr. Valberg.
Good afternoon.
Would you please go first to hearing exhibit 11, which is in your exhibit book?
It's in the white binder.
Yes?
Okay. This is an interrogatory response. Let me read the interrogatory. Dr. Valberg describes his background and experience beginning at line 13 on page 3 and continuing to line 4 on page 5 of his testimony, and supplies only 1 year in which these activities took place, 2007 at the end. Then I ask, please supply the years in which these various activities took place, or the approximate years, if necessary. Do you recall being asked to provide that information?
Yes.
Okay. And it says you're the author, Peter Valberg, PhD. You see that up above?
Yes.
Okay. So by this, it appears that after a degree at Harvard, you worked at Amherst College, and then you were at Harvard from 1978 to 1990. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Would you go to page 19 of your direct testimony? And if you'll see, that is the resume that was submitted along with your direct testimony. It was scheduled, well, it's just page 19. And do you see hold on. You see at the first paragraph, it's like the last sentence. It says, Dr. Valberg taught physics at Amherst College before coming back to Harvard and working for 25 years as a researcher and the faculty of the Department of Public Health. You see that?
Yes.
Isn't that inconsistent with the dates that you gave us before, that you were at Harvard from 1978 to 1990?
It's inconsistent in the sense that I was no longer full-time after 1990. And I was part-time at Gradient after that point.
Okay. Would you go to hearing exhibit 9? This is from the Gradient website. You'll see upper at the top, at the left, it says gradientcorporation.com. Do you recognize this page from the Gradient website?
Yes.
Okay. Can we stipulate that it's admitted in evidence? Yes.
No objection.
Yeah, no objection.
Hearing no objection, hearing Exhibit 9 is admitted.
So this describes the chemicals and subjects Gradient has worked on, and you'll see on the right, I may have highlighted it for everybody, but it's this statement here that says, "We employ sound science to assist national and global clients with resolving their complex problems relating to chemicals in the environment and the workplace, as well as in consumer products." Now, would you look at the products that Gradient works on? And those are here. And you'll see arsenic, asbestos, chlordane, DDT, diesel exhaust, lead, mercury, ozone, etc. Is this an accurate description of the products that Gradient works on?
I believe it's reasonably accurate. Yes, so the Gradient works on a discipline called human health risk assessment, and so these represent potential exposures that can be analyzed for potential health effects.
Okay. And in representing companies with respect to those chemicals, you're representing the manufacturers or the distributors, correct?
I don't know that I can make a global statement, but that probably is generally true.
Yeah. I mean, you represent, you have Gradient, and you have a representation of representing manufacturers of toxic chemicals. Isn't that fair to say?
We represent chemical manufacturers, but those same chemicals appear, for example, in Superfund sites. And the Gradient does work on Superfund sites for US EPA, or at least the time when Superfund sites were high on their agenda. So these represent not only chemicals that could be products of chemical companies, they could also be contaminants in the environment. And the question is often asked whether they're present at concentrations that could pose an unacceptable risk.
And you typically testify, the people at Gradient, that the chemicals don't pose unacceptable risks. Isn't that clear?
No, we don't typically testify to that. We determine what the unacceptable level would be, and if there are regions, let's say in the soil, where the acceptable level is exceeded, then it would call for a cleanup.
You yourself have represented chemicals, companies making asbestos, cigarettes, tobacco. I'm not sure which others, but tobacco and asbestos, you've come in on the side of the companies, correct?
Number one, it's probably inaccurate to say that asbestos is a produced product. Asbestos is a natural compound that has been found in various commercial products. And yes, the use of asbestos has posed hazards, and those hazards can be analyzed by the process of human health risk assessment.
Okay, well, let's go to Exhibit 10. And this actually is, I'm sorry, it's in tab 10, where I have reproduced it, but it is Lippmann Rebuttal Exhibit G. So it was introduced around September 20th into the docket. Okay. And that, you're familiar with this article, aren't you?
Yes, I have come across this article.
Okay. The article was written by the Center for Public Integrity, isn't that correct?
Yes, and the author was David Heath.
Okay. And the Center for Public Integrity has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for investigative journalism, isn't that correct?
I haven't kept track of that, but that could very well be correct.
The Center for Public Integrity is a fairly large nonprofit organization that specializes, I guess, in investigative journalism, correct?
Yes, it is a journalistic organization. That's perhaps an important point.
This article was written February 8, 2016, correct?
Yes.
And you understand that this article contains many statements that are derogatory about Gradient and even about yourself. Isn't that correct?
Yes, this was a journalistic article where David Heath took it upon himself to write a negative article that includes many misstatements, many ad hominem attacks, and it's not a scientific article. It has many scientific inaccuracies in it.
Okay. Did you ever bring a lawsuit against Center for Public Integrity as a result of that article?
No, we wrote up for our staff to explain what the differences were between what was in this article and truth. We wrote up a report that was internal. We felt that with the United States we have freedom of expression and First Amendment rights and so on, and that, yes, there would be no particular purpose to bringing suit.
Right. But you understand that defamation is an exception to the First Amendment. If somebody defames you, they don't have the right to do that without, bearing responsibility, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's go to just a few places in the article. If you go to page 3, and if you would read that paragraph first, Gradient belongs to, it's the 3rd paragraph on page 3.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. The paragraph in particular is just simply a conclusion about Gradient from an author, a journalist. We will stipulate to this being in the record. It already is in the record. We have no concerns, and the board can take it for what it is. I recognize this is cross, but walking through specific pieces of an article that's not germane to the topic that's before the board, I think, is not appropriate.
No.
Mr. Marcus, what is your response
Yes,
to
I'm
the
entitled.
objection?
Excuse me, Your Honor. I'm entitled to do my best to impeach Dr. Valberg. He has, put in a lot of statements about his research and how, his perspectives are different from Dr. Havas's. And I intend, frankly, to show that Dr. Valberg has a perspective that is not one that is universally appreciated in the scientific community.
Mr. Clisto, I am inclined to agree with your statement. However, I'm going to let Mr. Marcus continue because I don't have the ability to bring this witness back onto the stand if, when the other witnesses are brought forward, it's determined that the credibility reaches the same standards.
Thank you.
Mr. Marcus,
If you would
please take into consideration my direction.
Would you read that first paragraph, Gradient belongs?
I just will bring the caveat that this is an inaccurate statement, but the paragraph states, Gradient belongs to a breed of scientific consulting firms that defends the products of its corporate clients beyond credulity, even exhaustively studied substances whose dangers are not in doubt, such as asbestos, lead, and arsenic.
Okay.
And that statement leaves out the whole complexity of human health risk assessment.
I'm not going to go through so many of these. The board obviously can read the article themselves, but I am going to go through a few and ask you a few questions. If you'll just read the next paragraph, which describes certain analysis that was done by the Center for Public Integrity.
You mean the one?
Gradient scientists.
Gradient scientists rarely acknowledge that a chemical poses a serious public health risk. The Center for Public Integrity analyzed 149 scientific articles and letters published by the firm's most prolific principal scientists. 98% of the time, they found that the substance in question was harmless at levels to which people are typically exposed. And that's a determination that you'd have to look at each individual one to determine how that determination was made.
Okay. Let's go back to page 1, if we could. And I want to ask you about a particular scenario that they describe in the article that's related to your work. I can summarize this, but if you'll go to, on page 1, the third paragraph, I'll just summarize two or three statements and then ask you a question about it. But it is the case that this fellow Nelson, a lawyer from Tucker and Ellis, was representing companies who were being sued for their asbestos product causing mesothelioma. And Nelson wrote to you and asked if you would write an article or articles about how his theory could be valid that tobacco smoke has a radiation aspect to it that causes mesothelioma. And ultimately, you agreed to write the article. He was going to pay for at least part of it, correct? And you also appeared as an expert witness for that firm. Is that all pretty accurate?
Well, Mr. Nelson, defended companies that had those kinds of claims against them, and the most important thing in those kinds of cases is often what the dose is. And it's a fundamental principle of toxicology that dose makes the poison. Asbestos is a very ubiquitous substance, and there are different types of asbestos that have different risks of mesothelioma. So the process of risk assessment does definitely apply, even though asbestos is a, if you will, a red flag term. And so, yes, we looked at the cases there, and we examined whether or not there was some indication that there was radioactivity in cigarette smoke, which there is. And there's also a very good record of radiation causing mesothelioma, particularly in patients that are given radiation either for cancer treatment or for visualization of the respiratory tract. So we looked into that literature. We provided that information to him. Our conclusion was that the epidemiology of tobacco smokers did not support the production of mesothelioma by cigarette smoke.
What amount did he pay you for writing the article? It says in the center's article that you gave him a 10% discount. Is that about right?
I can't remember at that time what that was.
And it is the case that you did appear at or around the same time as the expert witness for his firm in blaming tobacco smoke rather than asbestos, correct?
Well, we pointed out that, yes, the tobacco smoke has radioactivity, and yes, radioactivity has a well-known record for producing mesothelioma.
Okay, but you testified, you agree you testified as the expert witness and also wrote the article, correct?
I contributed to the article, and I was the expert witness, yes.
Okay. If you'll go to Exhibit 14, this is one of the articles, isn't it correct? Robin Pruitt, Julie Goodman, Peter Valberg. And it's radionuclides in cigarettes may lead to carcinogenesis.
Yes, that's an article that discusses the action of ionizing radiation on enzyme systems in the body.
Okay, I want to go to page 4 of that article. And, okay, you know, at the end of the article, it's proper to put down, you call it acknowledgments or conflicts of interest that the authors have in writing the article, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And in describing the conflict of the Tucker Ellis firm paying you to write the article, contacting you about the article, communicating with them in the course of writing the article, and being an expert witness, you and the other authors say, we'd like to acknowledge and thank Tucker Ellis and West for providing some financial support for this paper. Tucker Ellis and West is a law firm that actively participates in smoking cessation programs for its employees and represents parties to litigation involving claims that exposures to different materials, including asbestos, may have caused or contributed to lung cancers and or other cancers. That is the acknowledgement that you decided was appropriate, correct?
Yes.
Now, you know if the American Petroleum Institute paid you for writing an article.
Mr. Marcus?
Yes.
So I am going to again advise you that you need to ask the witness the question. I also think that you've made your point. He's acknowledged that he represents companies. You've acknowledged that the exhibits are here for the board to read. In our proceeding, I believe that you have made your point. I need you to move on.
Did you tell IPL about the White Coats for Hire article before they retained you in this matter?
I believe they were aware of it. I don't recall a specific discussion.
It would be important that they be aware of it, though, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Because it could be deemed to be something that impairs your credibility as a witness, correct?
I would disagree with that characterization because, as I said, it's an article by a journalist and has no scientific basis. But in terms of a appearance of impugnment of expertise, that could be taken as correct.
Let's go to your testimony, page 10 of your rebuttal testimony. Hold on. The National Toxicology Program study is one you're very familiar with, isn't that correct?
Yes, I'm aware of that study.
Okay. And it's an animal study, and animal studies have, you know, a real importance in the scientific literature, isn't that correct?
Animal studies are regularly used by the National Toxicology Program to examine exposures. That is correct.
Okay. But it's important to have animal studies and not just epidemiological studies. Isn't that correct?
And you put your finger on the issue. Yes, it's one of the lines of investigation, one of the lines of scientific evidence that can be considered.
Right. And you've said in the past that in toxicology, animal studies are the gold standard of toxicology, correct?
They're the standard for a replacement for epidemiology studies and mechanistic studies. However, it's important to remember that all three lines of evidence play an important part.
But I was just asking about the animal studies. You agree, and you've said that in toxicology, it's the gold standard, correct?
They're gold standard because often those studies can be extrapolated to humans, but then there are also cases where the interpretation for humans is very clouded.
Right. And that's basically your position with respect to the National Toxicology Program study. Isn't that correct?
I don't know that those have been fully vetted. I mean, they have been published and so on, but in science, the actual publication appearance of an article is, if you will, actually the beginning of peer review rather than the culmination, because that makes the investigation and results available to all other scientists around the world to look at it and begin to appreciate how it fits in with what's already known and what's already known from other lines of investigation. So it's a contribution that's going to be evaluated in subsequent months and years.
In simple terms, though, animal studies are important because ethically we have permitted, the poisoning of the animals, so you can see cause and effect. You can, subject the animal to, some substance that is potentially cancerous or RF radiation or whatever, and see what happens, where you can't ethically do that with humans, correct?
Yes, you could do a controlled experiment where you have control animals and exposed animals. So that is an important strength of those kinds of studies.
On page 10, if you would go to line 7, page 10 of Dr. Valberg's rebuttal testimony. Okay. And would you read beginning in the NTP study?
In the NTP study, tumors appeared only in male rats and not female rats, and neither male nor female mice.
And continue, please, through the quote.
As the Scientific American article provided by Mr. Goldman points out, for the male rats, and should I go on?
Yes, please.
Rates for those cancers increased as the doses got higher, but the evidence linking them with cell phone radiation specifically was weak by comparison, and the researchers could not rule out that they might have increased for reasons other than RF exposure. Paradoxically, the radiation-treated animals also lived longer than the non-exposed controls.
So from your testimony, you're basically criticizing the tumors that appeared only in the male rats, and you're saying in the quote that the science, the evidence linking them with cell phone radiation specifically was weak by comparison. That's the quote from Scientific American. Isn't that correct?
That is the quote provided by Mr. Goldman
in
a Scientific American article.
Okay. Let's, if you'll go to Exhibit 15, you'll see two things there. I think you'll see first an American Cancer Society study, which is the exhibit, and then behind it, the Scientific American article that Mr. Goldman was citing, and the quote that you selected in connection with your testimony appears on page 5 of that Scientific American article. It's Lippman Goldman Rebuttal Exhibit A, page 5. So the quote, if you'll read the first 3 lines of, beginning in the second line, this, you see the strongest finding connected with RF? I'll find it for you. Okay. Good, someone found it besides me. Was that my finger? Okay, could you read beginning there, Dr. Valberg, the strongest finding?
I'm just trying to,
I'm
I may
sorry,
interrupt,
I'm
I'm trying to
still
find it in the
struggling to
document.
find it on page,
5 of the Scientific American article, which is behind the American Cancer Society. Do you guys have that?
By Moskowitz?
No. This is,
It's actually the last page of the exhibit.
thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Marcus, can I have you substantiate that you have several articles here together? Can you please start with the name of the article and then make sure the witness knows what article it is?
Yes, well, the only one I'm concerned with right now is the Scientific American article, which is already in the evidence as a Goldman exhibit. And then sometime later, I'll introduce the American Cancer Society article as an exhibit for the board to consider admitting.
Mr. Val,
I have the heading of what the page I'm looking at. It says the Lippmann Matara Hearing Exhibit 15, page 8, which I think I was now moved forward to the end of that.
Page 5 is, but it's hard to read the 5. I agree. This is,
He said Lippmann Matara, he said Lippmann Goldman.
it's, yeah, it should be Lippmann Goldman Rebuttal Exhibit A.
Oh, that's not what I have. I guess,
Yeah, you're in the right article. I could see from the picture. Keep flipping this way.
That's
So
not
I
a
believe
picture of
it's
what he's
in
looking at.
Hearing Exhibit 15, which has not been agreed to from yesterday, and it is also in Lippmann Rebuttal Exhibit A.
I can't find it.
Goldman Rebuttal Exhibit. Maybe we go the Goldman.
Lippmann Goldman Rebuttal Exhibit A, page 5. But if you go to 15, and it's the last page.
Okay. So this is from the Scientific American article, and I wonder if you could read from the second line, the strongest finding connected RF. Do you see that?
Yes. The strongest finding connected RF with heart schwannomas in male rats, but the researchers also reported elevated rates of lymphoma as well as cancers affecting the prostate, skin, lung, liver, brain, and the exposed animals. Rates for those cancers increased as the doses got higher, but the evidence linking them with cell phone radiation specifically was weak by comparison, and the researchers could not rule out that they might have increased for reasons other than RF exposure.
That's good enough. So that, if you remember, is the quote that you put in your testimony. Rates for those cancers, and those cancers that they're referring to are the research also reported elevated rates of lymphoma, prostate, skin, lung, and rates for those. The strongest finding is different. The strongest finding was heart schwannomas, but the researchers also reported these rates for these other cancers, and rates for those cancers was low. And you'll see that's the reading of this from the last 2 sentences. They concluded This is the results were reviewed by a panel of outside experts on the National Toxology Program. They concluded there was clear evidence linking radiation with heart schwannomas and some with these others. So isn't it clear from this quote that when the article refers to those cancers as having weak evidence of cell phone radiation, it's referring to cancers other than the heart schwannomas, correct?
Yes, it's referring to those other cancers, but I think when they say reported elevated rates, I think the particular element that's missing there is whether the elevated rates were statistically significant or not.
Okay.
And I think that many of them were not.
Okay, but my point is the reference to rates for those cancers referred to all but the heart schwannomas, correct?
Yes.
But go back to your quote on page 10. You selected this language for your rebuttal testimony. You said on line 7, page 10, in the NTP study, the tumors appeared. All the tumors, that's how someone would read that, is how I conceive it. And you say then from the scientific article, rates for those cancers increased as the doses got higher, but the evidence was weak. So I'm just saying, isn't it the case that the clear intent of the article was distorted by using selectively this quote, rates for those cancers, and applying it to all tumors, rather than to what actually was being said, and that is the rates for those cancers, that those cancers meant other than the heart schwannomas, correct?
They were reporting other tumors whose rates were elevated, and as I say, the key ingredient is how they compared to rates in non-exposed animals. Were they statistically significant?
Well, that may be the key ingredient in the research, but the key to someone reading your testimony is that you attributed that statement about weak evidence to all tumors rather than to the tumors other than the heart schwannomas, correct?
I agree that could be misinterpreted. That is correct. That the schwannomas were definitely the statistically significant ones.
Okay.
And there were other tumors that were noted at lower increasing rates.
Is it fair to say that, you may have more than one overall perspective about the research, but certainly one perspective is that whatever is said in the research, in the various studies, epidemiological studies, animal studies, your perspective is the guidelines are the guidelines. There's WHO, there's FCC guidelines, there's International Commission for Non-Ionizing Radiation Prevention, and on and on. The guidelines are the guidelines. And none of what is going on has resulted in evidence for whatever the disorder that wouldn't be, well, strike that all of this evidence doesn't matter because there are guidelines and the evidence hasn't yet come up to the guidelines. Is that, I may have said it a little inarticulately, but is that fair?
Guidelines are generated so that people can determine whether or not their activities are going to present a health hazard or not. And the guidelines of the FCC are just one set of guidelines. As you mentioned, there are many other sources of guidelines. And the WHO keeps a list of guidelines around the world. Now, if you look at those guidelines, yes, there are some that are higher, some of them are quite low, But I think for this proceeding, I think the take-home message is that none of them, of those guidelines, the WHO lists at least, are low enough to present a problem in this case.
Okay. But you understand that the people who write those guidelines have been criticized quite often for their ties to industry, let's say. Isn't that correct?
I think very much as the article that we just looked at regarding gradient, yes, there are articles out there that are criticizing people for having ties to industry and so on.
Yeah. For convenience, in tab 13, I have an article from 2017. I only put the first couple of pages, but if anyone wants, we could go. It's already been admitted as Lippmann-Matera hearing exhibit. Oh, no, sorry, Matera-Walton rebuttal exhibit F. I don't know if you remember that. Dr. Walton had this in his direct testimony, and you may have seen it there. It was an article about a group of scientists who went to the World Health Organization with a certain amount of evidence and tried to get them to reconsider what they were publishing as guidelines. Do you remember that Walton article? Or?
This article looks somewhat familiar, yes.
Yeah. It is published in 2017, the International Journal of Oncology. And if you go to underneath the abstract, just raise up a little bit, the authors are pointing out right here in 2014 who launched a draft of a monograph. That monograph is a specific study, isn't it? It's a study that's going to be made on in a specific area. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what I would understand that to be.
So in 2014, WHO launched a draft of a monograph on RF fields in health for public comments. Turned out that 5 of the members of the core group in charge of that draft are affiliated with the ICNIRP, an industry-loyal NGO, and thus have a serious conflict of interest. Do you agree with that the ICNIRP, International Commission, is an industry-loyal, non-government organization? That's what NGO means, correct?
No, I would not agree with that.
Okay. What evidence do you have that they're wrong?
Well, as I mentioned a minute ago, that it's not just the ICNIRP standards that are out there. The IEEE has standards, the NC has standards, our own National Commission for Radiation Protection has standards. I think the spectrum of standards is quite large. I don't see the ICNIRP standards as being somehow an outlier in that group of analyses.
Okay, but apart from the fact that there are other standards, I'm just asking about this one particular organization and the statement that they're an industry-loyal NGO, and thus the core group that has 5 of the 6 members associated with them has a serious conflict of interest.
Asked and answered objection. He just gave his answer as to why he does not think they are biased.
Well, I didn't think it was responsive, which is why I asked again. I'm asking if you have any.
So I'm sustaining his objection. I need you to attempt to have the witness answer the question instead of you restating the information.
Attached to your direct testimony was 3 schedules. I think it's C, D, and E.
Direct or rebuttal?
I'm sorry, this is direct. And I have just copied in, well, if we could go to the first page of each of these schedules. The first one is Schedule D, and that's the IEEE, and we'll get to the others, but I'm sorry, C is that same organization we were looking at, the ICN IRP. E is also the ICN IRP, and D is the IEEE. Isn't that correct?
Yes, I believe that is correct.
Okay. So of the three standards that you decided, for some reason, maybe most important or certainly had interest to you, the first, the IEEE, is a standard from 2005, correct?
Yes.
That's 13 years old. But if you look on the first page, about the fifth line of that standard, I'll show you where it is. It was page 13 of 250. It's an overview of the IEEE standard. Okay, if you scroll up just a little bit more, thank you. And you'll see that about the 2006 standard here, it's saying, maybe you could repeat it, from the recommendations, if you could read that.
The recommendations, which protect against effects associated with electrostimulation and tissue and whole body heating, are intended to apply to all human exposures except for exposure of patients by or under the direction of physicians and medical professionals.
Okay. And so this standard has to do with thermal effects, isn't that correct?
They reviewed all effects, and they found that the thermal effects were really the only ones they could hang their hat on.
Okay. It says, okay, the recommendations which protect against thermal effects, they don't say that the recommendations will protect against all biological effects. They're just dealing with thermal effects, correct? In the recommendations.
In many of these cases, and this is true of the WHO as well, when they review it, the effects that are classified as non-thermal come in a whole variety of different and often irreproducible settings. And so what they're saying, and what often other standard-setting organizations have found, is that there's not a non-thermal effect that is consistently reproducible, so that you could, in fact, develop some sort of standard.
Okay, page 14 of your direct testimony. Hold on. I'm sorry. Page 4 of your and it should be your direct. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, Dr. Valberg. It's page 4 of the rebuttal testimony. You see that? If you'll read page 4 of the rebuttal testimony, if you'll scroll down a little to the, saying third, line 13, maybe scroll up just a bit, please. Okay. Could you read that criticism by the American Cancer Society?
Yes, the third, the idea that RF below guideline levels causes cancer goes contrary to the position of the American Cancer Society, whose goal is to help people avoid cancer. In ACS's most recent 2014 review, the ACS states, in summary, most studies of people published so far have not found a link between cell phone use and the development of tumors. However, these studies have some important limitations that make them unlikely to end the controversy about whether cell phone use affects cancer risk.
Okay. And that was an important reference for you because of who the American Cancer Society is. So you use that to support your position that cancer is not going to be found in RF fields, correct?
I see the American Cancer Society as being a society that really tries to provide people with advice on cancer risk.
Okay. Would you go to Exhibit 15 now? And this is not yet admitted. It's an article of the American Cancer Society. The website from which it comes is in the top left, http pressroomcancer.org, NTP 2016. Do you see that? And if you go down to the bottom where it says that it's the NTP 2016 article, we pulled it off the website July 30. Do you have any doubt that this is an American Cancer Society report?
No, I don't have any doubt that they're now taking note of the NTP results that are coming out.
Okay. I'd like to offer this for admission as a hearing exhibit 15.
Is there any objection?
No, only that it is what it is, that it's been described as a report. It looks to me like a press release. So the board can decide what it is, but I have no objection to it being something pulled as counsel as represented from the American Cancer Society website on July 30th, 2018.
No objection.
And would you read?
Just a moment. Is there any objection to the entire Exhibit 15?
My only question for counsel is so I understand the press release from the ACS to be complete. Is the second article complete as well?
Is that electromagnetic radiation safety?
Yes.
Well, it's from a website of Dr. Joel Moskowitz, who is the director of the School of Public Health at UCal Berkeley. And his website goes on and on, but I just pulled from it the recent stuff that he had on the NTP study. That was my only interest.
I can clarify if that would be helpful. I know that we've been provided a book that has an Exhibit 15. Within Exhibit 15, there are 3 pages that have been agreed to. And to the extent that Exhibit 15 includes the first 3 pages, There is no objection, and it is admitted. Does that work for everyone?
Yes.
All right. So if any of the rest of it you're wanting admitted that isn't part of some other hearing exhibit, you'll have to address that.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's stay with the American Cancer Society. Dr. Valberg, could you read from the top? We're just going to read, 7 or 8 lines. But the U.S. National Toxicology Program has released.
The U.S. National Toxicology Program, NTP, has released partial results from an animal study of the effects of radiofrequency radiation associated with cell phones. The group found radiofrequency radiation was linked to a higher risk of 2 cancers. Below is a response from Otis W. Brawley, MD, and American Cancer Society Chief Medical Officer.
And would you read his quote, the next 3 lines?
Yes. The quote, "For years, the understanding of the potential risk of radiation from cell phones has been hampered by a lack of good science. This report from the National Toxicology Program is good science."
Okay. Do you agree with that?
I think the National Toxicology Program does good science, yes.
But specifically, this report on cancer in animals as a result of it, is that good science?
I think the results that they have reported are interpretable, and they represent science that's going to be examined for consistency with other science. I don't see any flaws in their methodology.
And lastly, on this topic, I'd like to go to Havas. It's Matera Havas Rebuttal Exhibit HHH.
Is that a tab?
You're going to have to look there. I'd have to give you this many pages. You want to get
She's working on it.
okay. I think if you go to page, I'll hope for the best, page 5.
You may.
8, I'm sorry, it's HHH, which is in the supplemental rebuttal testimony. Yeah, but there's a okay. So this is an article or commentary published in Environmental Research by Ronald Melnick. Do you know who Ronald Melnick is? Dr. Melnick?
Just
sorry.
give him a minute and let him get the, thank you. Let me know when you're ready. We'll.
Yes, I see that study.
Okay. And do you know Dr. Melnick? You know he's.
I don't know him personally. I think at one time he worked for the National Toxicology Program, but he appears to have his own consulting company, Ron Melnick Consulting, in Utah.
And he's a professor, professor emeritus at Amherst University, where you were. Did you happen? He would probably be a contemporary if that rings a bell.
I don't know that. I was actually a lecturer at Amherst College, a professor at Amherst College, not University of Massachusetts, at Amherst.
Okay. Well, Dr. Melnick is said to have been the principal designer of the National Toxicology Program study. And in this article, commentary, he goes through, if you'll look at the last 6 lines of the abstract, so you'll see that he's describing what the commentary is about. You want to read that?
This commentary addresses several unfounded criticisms about the design and results of the NTP study that have been promoted to minimize the utility of the experimental data on RFR for assessing human health risks. In contrast to those criticisms, an expert peer review panel recently concluded that the NTP studies were well designed and that the results demonstrated that both GSM and CDMA modulated RFR were carcinogenic to the heart, schwannomas, and brain gliomas of male rats.
Okay. And then, if you go to the next page, we'll go to the page after that, maybe. Sorry. Okay. He starts going through the various criticisms that he considers unfounded. One of those criticisms had to do with a statement you made, or a criticism, because you pointed out that the rats were exposed to RF radiation for 9 hours, correct? And that was one of your criticisms. Do you remember that?
Yes, 9 continuous hours every day.
Well, actually, it was 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off, if you remember. Okay. But 9 hours, and you criticize it, and he responds to that and says that basically, criticism 3, he thinks statistically that's the way you should do it. You probably heard this defense of it. That's the way you should do it. And from that analysis, you can determine cell phone exposure to humans.
Your Honor, I'm going to ask for a question, please.
Trying to just get concurrence to get through this on what the response to the criticism is.
So the problem is you're going to have to cite to the criticism, have him find it, and then ask the question.
Okay. Why don't we go to the bottom of the criticism, and that you will see, yeah, just above criticism 4, I think he summarizes from these data.
So I don't think you need to read it if you want to direct the witness to read that,
Okay.
and then ask your question.
Do you want to read that last part of it?
Yes, from these data, cancer risk estimates can be made for any pattern of cell phone use, while actual risks would be related to a number of factors, including cell phone emission values, side of head use of the phone, distance from the body that the phone is held, exposure to other RF emitting devices, etc.
Okay. So he does believe, at least, that from these data, cancer risk, actual cancer risk estimates can be made. Isn't that correct?
I think what he needs to say, I mean, if you look a little bit earlier in that same paragraph, is you need to be based on the tissue dosimetry, absorbed power, hours per day of exposure, and other comparable fraction of the exposed lifetime. So he's saying essentially what I had said earlier is that in toxicology, dose makes the poison. So you need to look at what is the intensity of the radiation, how long is the animal exposed, how much of that is absorbed, and so on. So yes, for these animals, you can look at what they had been exposed to, but I think my main contention was that the amount of radio frequency radiation the animals absorbed was far, far in excess of anything that you would get from a 1 1/4 watt smart meter.
And let's just go to his conclusion, which is on page 5, sorry. If you'll read that right above point 6, which is the addendum, if you go to his conclusion, it's page 5, look down a little farther. Yeah, there it is. Do you see in conclusion? Could you read
Yes.
that?
In conclusion, animal studies and mechanistic studies on RFR that have been published since 2011 clearly show that the evidence on the carcinogenicity of RFR is much stronger than it was at the time of the IARC evaluation. If the recent animal and mechanistic findings had been available in 2011, it's likely that RFR would have been classified as a probable human carcinogen.
Do you agree with that?
I think that's too complex. I mean, the current classification is 2B, and he's suggesting that it could be moved up to 2A on the basis of this one study. And exactly what the IARC would do, I don't know. I think it is interesting that none of the NTP investigators joined him as an author, that in a way he put this out himself and didn't have any support from other individuals.
Well, you don't know that he didn't have support from other individuals. He's the only one who signed that commentary, correct?
Well, he's the sole author, yes.
Okay. You have criticized, I think, Dr. Havas's research by pointing to the fact that radio frequency from cell phones is a different frequency than radio frequency from smart meters, correct?
Yes, I point out that in terms of figuring out how a given study, what implications it has for the exposure of interest, is that, yes, frequency is one of the things that you have to take into account in addition to a number of other factors.
But you're distinguishing, cell phones at their frequency versus smart meters at their frequency, and, maybe baby monitors at a different frequency, and frequency is different. But you understand that the FCC's guidelines, various guidelines, are applicable to all frequencies, correct?
No, that's not correct.
Okay, well, isn't it the case that there's a formula that the FCC has, and the way you determine the guideline is, the formula is the frequency will equal a certain amount of meters per centimeter squared. So you're going to find out the guideline in that meters per centimeter squared, and you're going to divide that by 1,500, correct?
The guideline as a function of frequency, yes, there's a graph or a formula, but I think the important thing is the standard is not the same at all frequencies.
No, the standard isn't the same, but all frequencies have a guideline, is my point. So that, for example, when you have 900 megahertz for a smart meter, that frequency, you take 900 megahertz as the frequency, and the guideline will be basically that 900 divided by 1,500, and that's, you get 0.6 and 600 microwatts per centimeter squared. If instead you had a frequency of 300.
Objection again.
Mr. Marcus?
Yeah.
You are again testifying. Is there anywhere in the record that you can point to with these formulas and frequencies to which you're wishing the witness to answer questions?
Yeah. If we go back to Material Rebuttal Exhibit C, page 144.
Is it in here?
I think it's in there.
Yeah, page 144, Rebuttal Exhibit C.
Again, it's the Exhibit C that has attached to it those non-confidential documents. And I'm restating some of this to make sure that when we read the transcript, we recollect that it's attached to that exhibit.
All right, I have Material Rebuttal Exhibit C, page 145.
144, if you'll go
Or
to.
144, okay.
And MPE stands for what?
Maximum permissible exposure.
Okay, so this is the maximum permissible exposures. And do you see that the limit for power density is S in the formula?
Yes.
Okay, so, and the way you get that limit, the limit, whether you're dealing with a smart meter or whatever, is the frequency divided by 1,500 microwatts per centimeter squared, correct?
Yes.
So if you got 900, like you do in a smartphone, then 900 over 1,500, and you wind up with basically 600 microwatts per centimeter squared, correct?
Yes.
And if instead in the formula you used cell phones, which I understand may be about 800 megahertz, okay, you would have 800 over 1,500, and you would have a slightly lesser standard.
Yes.
My math is okay. And if you had 300 microhertz frequency, you'd have 200 microwatts per centimeter squared, correct?
Well, I must object to that because this formula is correct, but only for a given frequency range. There are cut points on the frequency curve that don't follow this formula. So you can't use it over an unlimited range.
But you can use it for cell phones, for example, and smart meters, correct?
Over a limited range, yes, you can
Well,
use it.
they're close together, or fairly close together. Okay. Wanted to ask you one other question about the formulas. We have just admitted into evidence, I think it's 45, is it, or? It's, yes, 45. I don't know if you, do you have that, Dr. Bell?
Is this the OET?
Yeah.
Yes.
Have you heard of this concept? I have highlighted on the third page of the exhibit. This is not the complete FCC, bulletin, but you're familiar with OET Bulletin 65, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
That's the basic bulletin, or one of the basic bulletins anyway, that sets forth the guidelines, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And what they're saying in the section that I highlighted is that in some circumstances, for example, you multiply the guideline number by a certain amount, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that is because radio frequency radiation can be reflected off of surfaces, correct?
That's correct.
So if you're standing, outside near a building, and depending on what's around you, the radiation may be bouncing all around, and you really should multiply the guideline by some amount, correct?
And you can look at the geometry of the situation and answer the question of whether a multiplication would be in order or not. It really depends on, let's say, the roughness of the surface and whether the reflection is specular or not.
So let's suppose somebody is standing, outside the house near a smart meter. Let's defer what that smart meter is giving off in power density. But you might, under appropriate circumstances, the reflection, multiply that power density that's coming off the smart meter by as much as 4, correct? 4-fold increase.
If you had a perfectly specular reflection at close distances.
Yeah. So if you had a person standing right next to that smart meter against the house, and you have told us that that smart meter at 6 inches is 254 microwatts per centimeter squared, or a little less than half of the 600, that's the guideline. The guideline is 600 microwatts per centimeter squared. So this meter is emitting radiation at 254 microwatts. And you heard from the testimony of Mr. Reed that you can literally be 1 or 2 inches away from that antenna when you're right up against the smart meter, correct? So at that distance, a person would be experiencing radiation of 234 microwatts per centimeter squared, potentially multiplied by 4 to make 1,000, or close to 1,000, 950 microwatts per centimeter squared, correct?
So, Mr. Marcus, I'm not sure how the witness could answer that question. There are a number of breaks in there, so can you restate it and have him answer or confirm at
each point?
Yes, at each bullet. Thank you.
Okay. So let's go back. First of all, you heard Mr. Reed's testimony, and you understand that the antenna is 1 inch away from the end of the glass. So you could touch the glass on the smart meter and be 1 inch away, correct?
That's what I understand he testified to.
And you have told us in your direct testimony that at 6 inches from the antenna, the radiation is 234 microwatts, or 254 microwatts per centimeter squared, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And we just talked about a situation where, depending on, what's reflecting the buildings and the surfaces around, you potentially would increase by 4-fold the amount of the radiation striking the person, correct?
Not for the kind of radiation that's coming from the cell phone. Remember, this is for plane waves, meaning that they're propagating like, waves in the ocean and so forth. In the smart meter, you have a very point source antenna, so that they are, as you saw from the diagrams that Mr. Reed provided, it's radiating outward, like, if you will, a little light bulb, and the light is going outward. So the radiation, even if there were a reflecting surface within inches, the radiation is dispersing further as it gets reflected back. So it's traveling an additional distance, and its amplitude is being attenuated.
Okay.
So there are two major problems there. One is this is not plane waves, and number two, you would have to have a reflection surface within inches of the smart meter.
Okay, well, okay, so you're saying that in not all circumstances, it wouldn't be a fourfold increase, but depending on the closeness of a reflecting surface and so forth, could be twice or three times even the amount of the power density coming out of the meter. There's some number.
If you had a non-absorbing reflecting surface, you could have some small increase, yes.
Okay. You understand from Dr. Habas's testimony, whereas you consider what's important is the average of the power density over a 30-minute period, correct? And you understand that she believes that you need to also consider the peak power density, apart from the average, correct?
Yes, that may be, and we just saw in the article from Dr. Melnick that he focused on the average.
Well, okay. Her analogy was that you can dip your hand in scalding water and then dip it in ice water, and the average would show no harm, but that humans respond to biological extremes, correct? That's her argument.
Whether or not the peak or average makes a difference depends on what you're looking at. I can pass my hand through a flame, and even though the flame is hot enough to burn, if I do it quickly, the instantaneous heat did not cause damage.
Right. And you could take one aspirin over 30 days or take 30 aspirin in one day, and if you did the peak, you'd be in trouble, potentially, correct?
It depends on what you're looking at, yes.
Okay. And do you also understand, is it correct that the FCC does have guidelines and is concerned about the peaks?
I think it defers to IEEE or something like that.
Yeah.
I think the peak, generally speaking, the peak limits are much higher than the average limits.
Okay. Let me go to Exhibit 16. Do you stay in touch with Harvard and its various publications? And I think you testified that you do generally read literature. Okay. You're familiar with the I think it's called the Edmund S. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard?
No, I'm not familiar with that center. That's not my area.
Oh, okay. Well, if you go to Exhibit 16, this is an article from the Edmund Safra Center for Ethics titled, "How the Federal Communications Commission is Dominated by the Industries It Presumably Regulates." You see that?
Yes.
Okay. At the back, there's a list of endnotes that are citations. It's on page 57. Do you see that?
I see those notes.
Okay. Do you know who Edmund J. Safra is?
No, the author is Norm Ulster, but I guess the name of the center has Safra in it.
Okay.
But I'm not familiar with that name.
And there's a statement in the copyright page that says that the ebook is available under the Creative Commons 4.0 license at creativecommons.org, licenses by 4.0. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any reason to believe that somebody has taken the name of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard and put it on their document and used it inappropriately?
Objection, relevance?
Well, I'm just trying to lay the foundation to ask that the article be admitted.
I have no objection on its admission.
Okay.
Does any other party have an objection to the the Lippman material hearing exhibit 16 and exhibit 16 is admitted?
Okay. So the only other exhibit I'd like to admit is that the pages from Dr. Moskowitz's website, if we go to tab 15, I would seek to admit it as Lippman Matera, part of Exhibit 15, pages 4 to 8. The American Cancer Society was pages 1.1 to 3, and that's the way I've labeled it.
No objections.
Okay.
No objection.
Hearing no objection, hearing exhibit 15, pages 4 through 8 are admitted.
Okay. I have no further questions for Dr. Valberg.
The board members have, Mr. Turner, I apologize.
I have a few questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Could we go to the direct testimony, page 9, that we were talking about earlier?
Mr. Turner,
Yes.
we're going to take a break.
Okay.
So it is 3:46 or so. We will come back at 4 o'clock or when all three board members have returned.